Unspoken. Today we have an investigator, journalist, Terrilyn Simpson, who is also an editor of a new newspaper that will be coming out in a couple of months maybe, called Common Sense Independent. Welcome, Terrilyn.
Hi, thank you.
I'm glad you're able to make it here today.
Thank you, so much.
Now I hear that you were the recipient of a Paul Newman Award. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I was the recipient of the Pan American Paul Newman First Amendment Award in 1998 for work that I had done previously at a newspaper in Bucksport, Maine called the Bucksport Free Press. I broke the story of chemical exposure cases at Champion International Paper in Bucksport and covered it for about 2.5 years, and did about 35 investigative articles.
Oh, wow.
On the story. But the Newman Award was specifically for a final investigative piece that I was attempting to publish that would have been an overview of the entire investigative story. And
it would have? You didn't publish
It's never been published.
Why not?
The newspaper was shut down right after the story was completed.
Why was it shut down?
Well, the newspaper had been owned by a publishing company that owned several other newspapers, and after I covered the Champion story for a couple of years, the newspaper chain was sold to Courier Publications.
Now, Courier Publications, they own the York Coast County Star?
I believe so. The newspapers that I was aware of that they bought, that were which were part of my chain, was the Republican Journal in Belfast, the Bucksport Free Press, and the Bar Harbor Times, and then several shoppers, and they added that to Courier Publications in Rockland.
Okay, so it's most of the small town newspapers along the coast that they own.
It was at that time. They have since diversified, been sold, whatever. I haven't really kept track.
So they bought the Bucksport?
It was called the Bucksport Free Press. It was a 50-year-old weekly, a very small weekly, which I had been editor of for several years. And as editor of the Bucksport Free Press, I took on the Champion story after a worker died while working at Champion, and his widow alleged that he had died from chemical exposures.
And did he?
The case has never been decided. There were a second man died. His widow also alleged that he had died of chemical exposures, and approximately 35 other workers filed worker comp suits, also alleging chemical exposure cases.
Now, you were the editor of this newspaper in Bucksport.
Right.
Is this the average story that the average reporter would cover?
As far as the caliber of the story, is that what you're asking me?
The subject matter of the story, that's a pretty intense story.
Well, you know, it was a mill town in a paper, a paper mill town in a paper industry state. It was a tough story to do. As I said, and I emphasize this, it was a very small newspaper. And when I took the newspaper over as editor, the front page story was the town recreation news. There had been there had been a chlorine leak at Champion just prior to my taking over as editor. And that particular story appeared as a press release written by a staff member of Champion, and that appeared on the back page of the paper.
So when you took over, you took that back page and turned it into headlines.
I took the back page and I turned it into headlines, but I started feeling my way through the town, and my goal was to turn this into a hard news newspaper.
Were you from Bucksport originally?
No, but I was from that area.
You were from that area. So you knew the people, you knew the culture.
I knew, Some of it. I spent a lot of time just feeling my way around neighborhoods, talking to people, letting people invite me in for a cup of coffee, started making contacts with union members.
Now, was that easy for you? Were people receptive to you? Were they happy that you were taking their town newspaper and turning it into hard news?
People liked, I think many people, I think the majority of people liked it that they were getting a hard news newspaper. You know, I didn't intend to, I didn't go in there, I guess, with the intention of finding this definitive investigative story. You know, I remember my initial reaction to getting reassigned from another newspaper that I had been working on to the editorship of the Bucksport Free Press, and I said, what am I going to cover here?
Oh, God.
What?
So, were you an investigative reporter before then? You took on the Bucksport newspaper?
I was a reporter.
Of hard news?
I was a reporter of hard news, and I was a feature writer.
You were a feature writer. Okay.
So I did both. You know, I covered hard news. I did feature articles, and I don't think that I wouldn't define myself strictly as an investigative reporter. I mean, I think that the problem with that is if the only tool that you have is a hammer, then you tend to treat everything as if it's a nail. So I went in to do a story thoroughly. And during the course of becoming familiar with Bucksport and the politics of Bucksport and the work that was going on there, and just looking for stories in the town, this man, Norman Crossman, a 34-year-old mill worker, died. And I was told by you know, a contact that his wife had filed a wrongful death suit. And I very hesitantly called up this young widow.
That must have been hard.
It was very tough. Yeah. And told her that I had been given this piece of information. I did not know whether it was accurate or not. I felt very awkward about calling her at such a difficult time. She was a 32-year-old woman, left with 3 young daughters to raise, and asked her if at any point she would be willing to meet with me.
And she was?
She said, what day and what time.
So she wanted you to know the information?
She wanted me to know the information. They had struggled through the 8 months of his illness, thinking that he had been exposed to chemicals in the mill, trying to get someone to listen to them.
And nobody would believe them?
No one would believe them. And he ultimately died.
And what did the doctors say?
The doctors said that his pulmonary system had deteriorated to that of an 80-year-old man in an 8-month period without explanation.
Without explanation?
Without explanation.
Well, weren't they kind of curious? He was working in a mill, a paper mill, and that could have an effect on his life?
I mean, it sounds that easy. It sounds that easy from this perspective, but it's not that easy. You're working in a mill with millions of, or millions may be an exaggeration, with thousands of chemicals. And with the possibility of lots of cross connections. People come up with illnesses every day. You're working with a large workforce. There were approximately 1,200 workers there.
Was he? But he's the only one that got ill. Now he was an athlete, right? He was in very good shape.
He was a marathon runner.
He was a marathon runner.
Right.
Okay, so in very good shape, very young man, excellent health, and in 8 months he deteriorates to that of a.
He had a massive heart attack, and over that, and they.
In that 8-month period.
That initiated the 8-month period.
Okay.
He had a heart attack, and.
At 34.
At 34, which is unusual but not unheard of.
And the doctors thought he had a heart attack because they don't know?
They didn't know why. And you know, from the research that I've seen, it is possible, highly unusual, but it is possible to have a heart attack without explanation. and to recover. And 34 is certainly young for that to happen, but it happens. However, there were a number of other workers at the mill.
And did they get sick?
A number of them became seriously ill. About a year after Norman Crosman died, a second man died.
The same disease?
No, he died more of respiratory ailments.
Well, well, he had respiratory ailments too, if his pulmonary system was that of an 80-year-old man.
He died of massive heart failure.
Okay, yeah.
And there were varying degrees of vasculitis and skin and neurological diseases among the other workers. Now keep in mind that they were not all necessarily exposed to or allegedly exposed to the same chemicals.
So when you started investigating this plant, they must have gotten mad.
They weren't pleased with my
No,
work.
they couldn't have been pleased, okay? Because in a way, if you were the editor of the newspaper and you were making this hard news headlines, you were stepping on their toes. You were, you know, this plant is causing this man's illness. They must have given you a hard time.
We spent a lot of time arguing over my access to information, and before that particular, the chemical exposure story had started, before the first incident that I was aware of. I had assigned a story to a reporter about something that was happening at the mill. Certainly not a hard-hitting investigative piece, just some incident that was occurring at the mill. And I was not getting the story. And I finally asked her why it was taking so long to put this story together. It was about a new process that was being initiated at the mill. And she said that the PR person at the mill had not called her back to put her in touch with the person she needed to interview. And I said, well, do you know who that person is? Can't you just contact that person? Can't you just call him directly? And she said, oh, we don't do that here. We wait to clear it through the PR office at the mill. They would be very unhappy with us if we went off on our own and started interviewing their employees.
And what did you tell her?
I told her to get the story, and if she needed to call the guy up, to call the guy up. But I also didn't assign her any other stories, you know, along that line, and I started looking at how the mill was doing business with the town. And I mean, I simply reverted to what I knew, which was good hard news practices. I don't clear my information.
And so people at the mill, they treated you respectfully. They may have sidestepped you, but they didn't try to threaten you in any way?
I was threatened. I'm not 100% clear where all of those threats came from.
And the threats came after you started the story?
The threats came after I started the story of the chemical exposure cases. I had all of the windows smashed out of my office.
Oh my God. What did the police say about that or do about that?
Well, they investigated it, but you know, it was an incident that occurred at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night, Sunday morning kind of thing. The windows had been pelted with rocks, and then a beam had been thrown from a lower driveway, which would have made it, it was thrown through a second-story window from the lower driveway that ripped out all of the window sashes. And
So that must have been scary to continue after something like that.
actually, it was a very effective letter to the editor.
Oh. Yeah, I can imagine.
You know, I remember the woman who worked with me called me and said, you need to get over to the office. This was at 5:30, 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I just got a call from the police. The office has been pretty badly vandalized. And as we're standing in the office early on a Sunday morning and looking at broken wood and broken glass all over the place, and she said, so are you going to back down? And I said, are you kidding? This is the best letter to the editor I've ever received. You know, you sort of go along and you do all of your homework, and you try to ask all of the right questions, and you try to cover the bases. But I always leave, you know, in the back of my mind that margin for error. Do I have it here?
Right.
You know, am I on the right track? Am I verifying this? Am I double verifying it? You know, this is a very, very serious case. And
So this was a letter to editor saying you're on the right track.
I had gotten a call the previous week from a contact in the mill, a friendly contact. And he had said to me, start being very careful. And I sort of laughed and said, what are we talking about? We're talking about a little tiny newspaper in a little tiny town in Maine. What kind of careful are you talking about? And he said, there are people in here who are really angry about what you're doing. And he said, you just need to be careful with everything. And
did you tell the police that?
No.
Oh, you didn't?
No. You know, I let them cover the incident as a straight act of vandalism. I had no information to the contrary. I was very clear that the person who had, you know, given me the information to start being cautious had no specific information. So it would have been a dead end, and I did not want to. I did not want to become the subject of my own story.
What did you learn as a result of doing this story?
I watched a group of workers and their family members betrayed by everyone who they trusted. They went to their union, they went to the company, they went to OSHA, they went to their U.S. senators, their U.S. representatives, as the result, in part of the newspaper coverage and in part of complaints from workers and family members, NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, came in and did an investigation of the mill. And nothing ever quite got completed.
Because there were payoffs, because of political reasons, because somebody knew somebody. So justice wasn't done. The person that needed to be taken care of was sacrificed.
I mean, I can't say that there were payoffs. I mean, I don't think, you know.
But something wasn't done right.
Something wasn't done right.
And you don't know why.
That's correct.
And why is something isn't done? Why wouldn't something be done right, though, in a manner like that?
Well,
political reasons, right?
Political reasons, but if you have political reasons, business reasons, that might be the same thing. But if, for instance, you have an OSHA investigation in a workplace, then any findings from that workplace are transferable to any other workplace in the country owned by that company. So Champion in North Carolina would be held to the same standard of the changes which were mandated at the Bucksport mill. And that does become very political. It also becomes financial.
So if you're an investigative reporter or a journalist, it's hard to get the truth out if we're living in such a political society.
Well, it's difficult to get accurate information out, I guess, because, you know, newspapers print whatever form of the media that you're in. They're also business institutions.
And isn't that why your article, your final article, which you won an award for, didn't get published because of the newspaper, which is a business entity rather than an institution out to get the truth out?
You know, I can't say. I mean, Courier Publications would never give me a reason for not publishing the final article. It was a very, very lengthy article. They never published it. And just to clarify, what I got the Newman Award for was actually not the specific article, but my, I'm trying to think of the word they used, determination, I guess, to get the story out accurately, to my refusal to back down. So they never actually reviewed the specific article. They reviewed my previous articles, they reviewed my history of it, they reviewed synopsis.
Your persistence of going after the truth.
Right.
Okay, against a lot of obstacles and threats.
And I had a very clear agreement with Courier Publications that they would publish this story. They never gave me a reason for not publishing the story. When Courier Publications and I finally parted company, I took the story to another Maine publication and had an initial preliminary quasi-agreement with them that they'd publish the story. And when Courier was told about this, they told this other publication that if they published the story, they would see them in court.
So the rights belong to Courier Publication, not you?
That's in dispute.
That's in dispute right now.
I don't think that was clear to the other publication.
But you can always rewrite the story.
That's correct.
I mean,
it was simply that another publication did not want to take on a court battle with a large publishing entity.
You know, when I was a little girl, I used to always think of newspapers as being the institution where the common person could get the truth. And I imagine when I was younger, the politics of the newspaper world was different than it is today. You may have your smaller competing newspapers in each town, but that's changing. It's not like that anymore.
It's changing. I think that there's always been a lot of big business influence and political influence on newspapers. I mean, if you go back and look at, the Spanish-American War, the information that, was portrayed in New York newspapers was not necessarily accurate.
Really?
It was very politically motivated.
Okay.
But
even back then, all right.
But I think that what has happened, and you're seeing it, happen on an increasing level, is that smaller newspapers are being bought up by larger publishing chains.
And therefore they're becoming more and more political.
They're becoming more and more homogenized, I think. They're often purchased as, a business venture.
Way to make money, way to advertise. So their headlines are not going to be hard news. They're not particularly interested in hard news because that could create waves.
Well, that seems the tendency, and that's not an across-the-board thing. I mean, there are some stories that they're willing to take on, and in my mind, the stories that they have been more willing to take on are the stories that are more politically correct. It's fine to take on a story lambasting Maine Yankee, but in Maine, but it's not fine in Maine to take on a story scrutinizing the paper industry.
Of course not. Yeah.
So there's a fine line there, but there is a difference.
So how do people, and a lot of people will depend on journalists to bring us the truth, to bring us all sides of the story. I think this is what cable access is. Anyone can come on this show and say whatever they want from their viewpoint, which is good, because then more people, the more different perspectives you hear, the more you get at the truth. So how should the average person look at newspapers today?
Well, I mean, I think that the old adage, just because you read it in the newspaper
doesn't make it true.
Doesn't make it true. Yeah. I mean, I think that people need to question. And I know that you know, everyone's schedule is busy today. I know it's difficult to scrutinize every issue. But if you're reading an article in the newspaper and it doesn't seem to make sense, or it leaves gaps, or it leaves questions hanging, or don't assume. I mean, I think for the average reader, they need to not assume that they simply don't understand what's going on. You know, if your questions aren't getting answered, then the questions may not be getting answered.
Okay, so that the journalists aren't putting in the correct information, or they don't have all the information to put in.
It may be the journalists, it may be, you know, it may be the politicians.
Okay.
You know, I think that people often forget, you know, that we're a political system, and that those, you know, those bureaucrats, those politicians work for us. They are our employees. You know, the person we send to Congress, the person we send to the legislature.
Have you ever interviewed any politicians?
Yeah, you know, through the years I've interviewed a number of them.
And how did they go? How did you like interviewing politicians?
I think it's, for the most part, it's like interviewing anyone else. It's a mixed bag. I interviewed then Congress, when I was working on the Champion story, I interviewed then Congresswoman Olympia Snowe.
Mm-hmm.
And
what was her reaction to this? I mean, this was a big story. Someone died. You know, a young woman, 32 years old, was left with 3 children. And did she have an interest in this?
She had an interest in it. My interview with Olympia Snowe was in tracking what her office had done
Mm-hmm.
in response to their requests from the constituents, in this case, both workers and family members.
Because
And
this woman, Mrs. Crosman, was it?
Right.
Did she contact?
I'm not sure if Deborah Crossman contacted Olympia Snowe. I know that the widow and adult children of the other man who died
Mm-hmm.
contacted Olympia Snowe. My recollection, and this was a story that occurred back in the early 90s, so my recollection was that Deborah Crossman also contacted Snowe's office, but I know that some other workers who were experiencing problems, you know, health problems,
Mm.
that they felt were linked to their work at the mill, had contacted her office.
And do you remember how they responded to these?
Well, I mean, the one thing that I was particularly looking at, and I looked at a series of things, but the one thing that I particularly looked at the time was a family member of one of the men who had died had contacted NIOSH, again, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They had sent a team of investigators to the mill to interview workers, to scrutinize work conditions. They have access to medical information. They send in epidemiologists. And
what do they do?
They, this team of experts studies the information, gathers the information, disseminates the information, and what NIOSH specifically does, it's not an enforcement branch. NIOSH makes recommendations to OSHA. But they have access to a lot of information and the ability to study that information. And what seemed to keep occurring in the NIOSH investigation was that they were making headway that was very, very difficult to track. And the research would go along for 6 months, and then several staff members would be reassigned, and there would be a new team to study the Champion situation. And this had dragged on for well over a year by the time the family member contacted a doctor at NIOSH and complained about the length of time that the investigation was taking with no tangible results. And the doctor said to the family member that everyone had to remember that this was a highly political situation. And the family member became very agitated, very angry about that, and complained to Snow's office.
It wasn't political to her, you know.
It was not political to her. It was personal
or
with
her children.
And I don't think that the doctor was trying to put her off. I mean, my take was that this was the first person who was really willing to stand up and say, look, you know, I've picked up, this portion of the investigation. I've just been assigned to this, and there are a lot of players involved in this. This is not a simple thing to put together. And by then, there were congresspersons, company officials, OSHA officials, workers' comp, all kinds of lawyers. And, but when this woman, this individual complained to Snow's office, within 2 weeks, possibly less, but certainly no more than 2 weeks after that complaint, the doctor who had made that comment had left his employment at NIOSH and gone back to working in the private sector.
So you felt that Snow's office did something for her constituent at this point?
No.
Oh, no?
No.
Okay.
Just absolutely the opposite.
Oh, okay.
There was no, I felt that this doctor, by, being outspoken, had been...
Was eliminated?
Eliminated may be too strong a word.
Okay.
He was, I don't know what happened. He wouldn't talk about what had happened.
So this put the investigation back more?
This set the investigation back.
Okay, so Snow's office did not help this woman.
No, when I contacted Snow's office for the interview, I pointed out that a week after this staff member from NIOSH had made this complaint, that he had left NIOSH. And I asked if they did not think that this was suspicious. And the staff member who I spoke to at that point said, yes, he thought that it was possibly, suspicious. And I asked what they were going to do about it, and they said absolutely nothing.
And why was that?
You would have to ask now Senator Snow's office.
Oh.
And so later, when I interviewed Congresswoman Snow, and keeping in mind that at that point, Congresswoman Snow was married, or is married, but Jock McKernan was then governor of Maine. She became very angry during the course of the interview. And what it seemed to me at the time, one of the reactions was that I thought that I was simply doing my job as a journalist. I was simply asking hard questions.
Like you were
and
doing...
expecting answers, as I would do with anyone else. And it seemed to me, from her very angry reactions, that she did not expect to be held to that level of accountability.
She didn't want to answer the questions.
She did not want to answer the questions. She misrepresented some information to me. She became very angry and yelled at me several times
at you?
In the conversation. And the day after the interview, now Senator Snow, but Olympia called my publisher from the floor of the Republican National Convention and lodged a complaint against me.
Because you asked her some questions.
She did say that she did not like my attitude during the interview. And I don't know how that played into the story not being published.
But that sort of gets back to where we were at the beginning, that this was a very political situation.
It is a political situation.
You were stepping on somebody's toes, and this mill, which is a business, and they need to make money, and then your newspaper is a business that needs to make money, and Olympia Snow, she wants more power, so she needs her votes, and having the truth come out would affect the businesses and affect votes for her.
Well, and again, I think that people need to look at how having the truth come out plays into it. you know, I mean, businesses do need to make money. And there's nothing wrong with businesses making money.
There's nothing wrong with making money, but when you're running a business that's endangering somebody's life, that's having 3 daughters lose their 34-year-old father because of chemicals that shouldn't be in the water, was it?
Well, there were chemicals in the water, but again, to clarify something, although I believe that it is highly likely that those chemical exposures did occur at Champion, my main problem and the point of my investigation was the lack of accountability by all of the agencies who were supposed to be investigating this. So I cannot definitively sit here and say, I know that Norman Crosman died of chemical exposure. The point is, no one knows exactly why Norman Crosman died because no one completely did their job.
And then the question is, why didn't they completely do their job? Why didn't they do their job?
Well, you take an industry, and we just happen to be taking the paper industry in the state, which has made a huge contribution to the state. But there is also, with any industry in the state, there is also a heavy lobbying effort. They make contributions to politicians. Politicians vote on bills that will affect that particular industry. And, you know, some of those bills can be more industry friendly than other bills, and it makes sense that they are going to, that a specific industry is going to support a specific politician. I think where, again, it gets into trouble is the lack of accountability, and why none of those investigations were completed.
Is the paper mill still a business today?
The paper mill is still a business today. It has since been sold. It's no longer owned by Champion.
And when did they sell?
It was either last year, within the past couple of years.
Oh, okay. So they had this tragedy, what, 10 years ago, but they stayed in business for at least 8 or 9 years after that.
Well, I mean, Champion International Paper is, it's a worldwide.
Oh, it is worldwide. So it's a huge business.
Right.
The more money they have, the more power they have, I guess, the more politics involved. How do you wish it had ended?
Well, as a journalist, my goal was to see the story published. And the point of a journalist taking on a story like that is to raise questions. I don't need to have the answers.
Okay, so the
my job is to raise the questions, to give an accurate account of what actually occurred.
And that's why you won that award.
Right.
And that award came with, what, $25,000?
It did.
So it's an excellent award. You almost got to meet Paul Newman, right?
I almost got to meet Paul Newman, but...
But he came to Maine when you went to New York.
Correct.
That's too bad. And so, where did you go after you left the Bucksport newspaper?
Actually, I took a bit of a hiatus from journalism.
You needed the rest.
Well, I wasn't, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. I've wanted to be a writer and a journalist all of my life. But that was a difficult story to see end left in limbo,
Yeah.
I guess. A lot of workers at Champion, a lot of family members had gone through some really difficult times to help me to get access to the information.
So they were disappointed too.
They were disappointed. They were disillusioned. They
Yeah.
were, and I was somewhat disillusioned.
And disillusioned not with the company, but the system and how the system works.
With the system, and one
With
thing.
Snow's office.
Well, my specific disillusionment was that I had done a piece of work in good faith for a publisher, and the publisher had not kept the agreement to publish that piece. So my disillusionment was not with the politicians or the agencies. My disillusionment was that
publisher.
with the publisher.
Okay. But you do have a new newspaper coming out called Common Sense Independent. I guess this is just an excerpt from it.
That's an excerpt from the issue that I'm working on, which will be the first issue.
Okay. And tell me about this newspaper coming on.
It is going to focus on in-depth, comprehensive pieces. One issue, the first issue, focuses on the death of Logan Marr, the 5-year-old girl who died in foster care, and issues surrounding DHS.
Now, so did you investigate this material yourself?
I have. I'm still in the process.
And how do you compare it to the Champion Mill work article you did?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the startling things is to watch the failure of the system to serve the people that it was established to serve.
DHS. When you talk about the system, you're talking about DHS?
I'm talking about DHS, the Department of Human Services. I'm talking about, in this case, the state legislature. I think that there's a whole industry of counselors and therapists whose intent, by the nature of their work, is supposed to be to serve, or I mean, that's not exactly a body in the way that the legislature or the Department of Human Services is a body, but I mean, one thinks of a therapist as
a helper.
A helper of people that
need assistance.
That's correct.
Or a helping hand or guidance.
I think guidance, helping them work through some difficulty in their life. And I think that probably the majority of counselors and therapists and psychologists in this state do that. But the Department of Human Services does have an approved list of counselors, therapists, and psychologists who are primarily the ones that they allow to testify in cases, and what this small segment of that particular population does is gather information about parents and turn it over to DHS to be used against the parents.
Oh my goodness. So they come in the guise of helpers, and really they're there to gather information to use against them.
Well, you know, in some instances, certainly not in all instances, but in some instances.
So DHS, I mean, if you're a poor single parent and you're having trouble with your personal life or with your work life and things aren't easy, and you turn to DHS for help, you might get your child taken away from you.
Well, that's one scenario.
Okay.
I don't think you need to be poor or single in the state for that to happen anymore.
Really?
You don't necessarily need to turn to DHS for help, although certainly people, parents who have been in the system, DHS has access to more information more easily. For instance, if you're a mother who's getting, you know, aid to families.
Mm-hmm. On welfare?
On welfare.
Okay.
You have to, you know, go through a series of interviews, and you know, your file has to be updated. Then it's very likely that you know, the information is easier to access.
What information are they looking for?
I think that varies from case to case. And again, I just wanted to comment on something else that you said. You said if you're having some problems in your personal life, you can become a target of DHS. Mm-hmm. That's, again, one scenario. But if you, if there's the perception of you having problems.
Oh, so if someone is judging,
I think it's become a highly subjective process. I think it's become extremely subjective.
so if a social worker or a counselor or therapist comes in and says, well, I don't like your lifestyle, that's not how I would live my life, or that's how I don't think children should be brought up, they could decide your values are wrong and I'm going to take your children away.
I think that's happening a lot.
That's happening a lot.
And that may be a simplistic way to describe it, because it's certainly an involved process. But I think that is very much what is happening in many cases, which is not to say that there are not cases in this state where children are being abused, and they probably need not to be left.
The children need to be
those homes.
protected.
The children need to be protected.
But sometimes, instead of protecting the children, they're abusing their power and pulling the kids away because they're judging a person's lifestyle.
From the case, from the cases that I have looked at, from the number of people who I have interviewed, the kinds of stories that I'm hearing with very similar details over and over again, I think that that's happening a lot. I mean, you have a caseworker in the Logan Marr case, a caseworker in her 20s, who made a judgment that these two little girls would be better off somewhere else. There was not a specific allegation of abuse.
There was so it was a mom and dad, or just a mom, or what?
Their mother was their primary caretaker.
Okay, and she had two young daughters, and how did DHS get involved?
It's a long and complicated story. There had been some concerns, and I don't want to go into all of the details at this point, but there had been some concerns that she needed help with her parenting skills.
Okay.
Before
That doesn't mean that
Logan's younger sister was born. So Logan was taken into custody when she was about 2 or 3 years old, while Christy Baker Marr, Logan's mother, was pregnant for Logan's sister,
Bailey.
Right. And but Logan was eventually reunited with her mother, and later.
Now, when you say parenting skills, I mean, that's a broad term, you know. Parenting skills because she was screaming at the child, because she was spanking the child, because she was leaving the child home alone. I mean,
There were none of those allegations.
none of those allegations. So what is parenting skills?
One of the criticisms of Christy Baker Marr was, by DHS, was that she was alleged to have moved too often.
She moved too often? Okay.
That was, in fact, probably the primary allegation against her. She was never accused of physical abuse.
Uh-huh.
Physical abuse was not alleged in the Logan Marr case. And I don't think verbal abuse was alleged in the Logan Marr case.
So her parenting skill was because she moved. Why did she move too often? I mean, there could be a lot of reasons for that.
Well, again, there could be a lot of reasons for that, and we could, sit and...
And it's nobody's business, really, whether
right.
how often you move.
But we do not take, we are not supposed to be taking, societally, we don't take away the children of migrant workers. We don't take away the children of military personnel.
That's right.
We don't take away children from families who move too often.
Right.
That is not necessarily in the mandate for creating a stable home environment. The mandate, the federal mandate, is that children need to be protected.
And they need to be loved.
And they need to be loved.
Yeah. They need to feel safe and they need to feel loved. So that's a fact that Christy, what's her name again?
Christy Baker Marr.
Christy Baker Marr was not accused of physical abuse of her daughter, sexual abuse of her daughter, verbal abuse of her daughter, neglect, She wasn't accused of
No.
any of those things?
She was not accused of leaving her
Or
child
leaving her
alone.
child alone. She wasn't accused of, wow, that's terrible. And they took her child away
And they took both of her children away.
because she moved too often.
That was the major allegation.
Now, she was on welfare.
I don't think that that's been firmly established.
All right, all right. And she wanted her children.
She did want her children.
And now, she was only getting supervised visits. Is that, I don't know a lot about the case, but isn't that she only had supervised visits? She couldn't visit her girls by herself?
That's my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert on DHS procedures, and I don't want to sit here and pretend to be an expert. From the number of people who I have interviewed, which includes interviews with family advocates, lawyers who take a number of DHS cases, and a number of parents and family members, supervised visits have become more the norm than the exception. So that if your child is in DHS custody, it is very likely that any visit that you have with that child, you're going to have a visiting supervisor sitting there taking notes and observing all of your interactions.
That's pretty intrusive.
Well, in some cases it may be appropriate.
But not in Christy's case.
It seems unlikely that it was necessary in Christy's case.
That it was necessary?
It seems unlikely that it was necessary.
Okay. How did you get involved with this story?
I had been looking at another DHS case that I had been given some information about. And so I had already started to look at DHS procedures and this other case when Logan Marr died in DHS custody. And
chances are that little girl would be alive and happy if she was still with her mom, from the information that you know.
From the information that I've seen, I mean, keeping in mind that, she came from a home where no one had ever been accused of physically abusing her. I mean, I'm certainly not sitting here with any inside knowledge about what happened in the home of Sally Schofield, the foster mother and the former DHS worker.
Yeah, but the
who's
child
alleged
was
to
in the
have killed her.
basement, in a chair with duct tape over a 5-year-old. I mean,
correct.
my goodness. And how many children did she have custody of?
She had custody of Logan and her sister, and she has 2 biological children.
What was in her mind to put duct tape over a child's mouth? That's just incredible to me. And wasn't she also a caseworker, a social?
She had been a former DHS caseworker.
So how much are they screening the people that they're handing these children over to?
Well, I think that that's a good question that DHS should be held answerable to.
And I'm wondering about the group of people that made that decision to take that beautiful little 5-year-old girl away from Christy and hand it over to this woman that allegedly killed her. What do you think they must be feeling? Or do you think they just did their job?
Well, I think that many of them feel that they did just do their job. Again, this is how the system is working. Maine is terminating the parental rights of an extremely high number of children.
I hear higher than almost any other state.
That's correct.
And why is there any financial benefit for the state to do that?
Well, they do get a financial benefit from the federal government
For each child
for each child who is adopted. So each child who is moved out of the foster system and placed in a permanent adoption situation.
But why is Maine taking more children away from their natural parents than any other state? There's got to be something wrong right then and
Well,
there.
I think that that's...
Something's wrong with Maine people. Maine people are just fine, right? But there's something wrong with the system that would do that?
Well, I think that that's a question that Kevin Kincannon, the Commissioner of the Department of Human Services, should be made to answer. And I think that there are a number of investigative hearings occurring since Logan Marr's death into the Child Protective Branch of the Department of Human Services. And I think that a lot of I don't think information has been particularly forthright from department officials.
Just like they weren't forthright in your first investigative case 10 years ago.
That's correct.
And so this might be dragged out too, and answers may never be found. Go ahead.
No, I think that that's a good point, but again, I think that the citizenry of Maine needs to remember that these officials work for them. They are our employees. Kevin Kincannon works for the citizens of Maine.
But when you try to approach them, they don't have that attitude. I can remember one politician, one bureaucrat said, "We are no longer servants. We are no longer your public servants. We are officials." And that's a huge attitude to say that.
Well, they are officials, but that does not, that doesn't mean that they're no longer public servants.
Well, I wish they would all remember that, but I think...
Well, there are ways to remind them. And again, I know that it's not easy to always follow political campaigns and to make informed decisions. But if the citizens of the state of Maine want these systems to change, then they
gotta pay attention.
They need to pay attention, and the one way that they can hold them accountable is to hold them accountable at the polls. State Senator Susan Longley is running for Congress. She's going to, she's hoping to run for John Baldacci's seat. Senator Susan Longley is the chairperson or the co-chairperson of the Health and Human Service Committee of the legislature. That is one branch of the legislature that should be getting the answers that people are asking.
And she's not getting them?
From the hearings that I've been to, and I certainly have not been able to attend them all.
And so if she's not going to answer the people about this, she's going to sidestep their questions about other things as well.
And I think it's beyond that. You know, I was at a hearing in Augusta where approximately 50 parents and grandparents showed up to testify before this particular committee. And at that particular hearing, Senator Longley was chairing that particular hearing. And I thought that her attitude, and I've covered a fair number of hearings of various types through my 15 or 20 years as a journalist. And I thought that she did very little to put people at ease. These parents drove from all over the state. Most of them were there because they had children who had been removed from their home and who were in DHS custody. They were very intimidated by this process. I would guess from watching them testify that they had probably never testified publicly in a setting such as this. They were given 5 minutes each. Senator Longley began the hearing by reminding them that I don't have the exact wording, but that this was not going to turn into a rabble-rousing mob, and that they all needed to remember that there were security personnel near at hand.
Oh, so her attitude wasn't very respectful.
Well, you know, I've covered, probably a few hundred hearings at this point of various kinds. I have never seen a group of constituents treated
so shabbily
by a public servant. And these were not people who came, if anything, they were probably the most seemingly intimidated group of people who I have ever seen testify at any public hearing anywhere on any issue. Many of them were in tears, they were clutching pictures of their children. They really, many of them, some of them gave very clear stories, some were very unclear about how to synopsize their case. And you're talking about a case that may go on for years and years and years. And yet they were expected to get up and make some memorable point to this legislative panel in 5 minutes, given no guidelines ahead of time, chastised severely, and interrupted anywhere from 2 to 4 times during the 5-minute testimony.
I think I probably could talk to you for another hour at least. But our time is up. Is there one thing you want the audience to remember before we have to go off the air?
Well, I think that people need to hold public officials accountable.
Yes, they do.
And I think that people need to remember, again, the point that we've just been making, is these are public servants. There is a way to hold them accountable. You know, you get what you pay for, you get what you elect. And there is a system out there that is supposed to be serving the citizenry of Maine.
And it's not.
And it's not.
And so don't vote for Susan Longley, for sure. Where can they get your newspaper?
I will be distributing, we haven't worked out all of the circulation yet, but I will be distributing on news counters.
Okay.
I'm very hopeful to be on newsstands by December.
Okay.
I think that you have posted the phone number.
Yes, we have, right.
And the address. And I am compiling a list. The first issue of the paper, you know, I'm trying to do mailings to people who request it.
Okay, thank you.
So, thank you very
It's
much.
been wonderful. You want to look for this newspaper? Common Sense, independent. Read what you need to know. Look for it around December. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.